Hey guys, it's Drake, and today I'll be making a video that covers the last about 3 months of my reading since I've made a video. So it's going to be jumping around from a bunch of topics, but after looking back at all these, I kind of see a thread, an intuitive thread that I was kind of following, I think, as I was reading through. So this first book here is one I mentioned that I was reading in my last video, I think before I put out the video on traditional Chinese literature. And I finished reading it, and it was extremely eye-opening. Even just the concepts that are on the front cover: carrying capacity, cornucopian myth, drawdown, cargoism, overshoot, and then of course crash, thinking of humanity ecologically, has been really eye-opening for me. And really, I think the most amazing thing is that this book was first published in 1980. That's really been the most troubling aspect of it for me because, the first Earth Day was, 1970, I believe, and it was a huge mass demonstration. And one of the correlations you can draw between subsequent Earth Days or the IPCC meetings and all this kind of thing, one of the correlations you can draw is as we have more Earth Days, carbon emissions and pollution and things get worse. So it's a troubling connection there, but this book kind of covers, I think, more like structurally or systemically thinking about how the human economy connects with the environment that we live in, the earth. So really eye-opening for me. He has a second book after this one called Bottleneck, which I've just skimmed. I don't think it's quite as powerful as this one, but this one is excellent and it got me on a whole different reading path. So highly recommended here, Overshoot by William Catton. And then also subsequently too, one of the reasons why I read this book is because I had been listening to, especially over the summer, but still kind of trickling in lately, is this podcast called The Great Simplification, which has a lot of stuff relating to just oil commodities and production, permaculture, ecology, farming, just all sorts of really fascinating stuff that I've been interested in lately. So highly recommend Overshoot, published by University of Illinois, interestingly enough. Find Deloria's on the back, who will come up, Alfred Crosby. So it's great stuff. And then this book, along with one of my classes I teach, totally set me on a different reading trajectory than I would have been otherwise, I think. So this book here, published by NYRB, called The Cowshed by Ji Xianlin, Memories of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. So this book I'd been interested in for multiple years. I had been looking for it, and just for one reason or another, I never ordered it online, and I never ran across it in a bookstore. But this local bookstore opened up, Alienated Majesty, which is from an Emerson quote from his essay, Self-Reliance. They opened up. They have pretty good taste. Best taste I've ever seen in a new bookstore. And I picked this up finally, and I read it. And it was really eye-opening for me. So Ji Xianlin was a linguist, a philologist, as they would have said back in the 40s when he began it, 30s and 40s. But the amazing thing is he was born from the poorer classes in China, around 1910 or so. So right around when he's born, the Qing dynasty falls apart. There's a revolution. There's a civil war for decades. And then 1949, Mao and his Communist Party solidifies power in China. Well, through that period, Ji Xianlin, who himself was born in poverty, born in the countryside, a rural peasant family, he goes to school and he's picked out as being fairly bright. So he has an uncle who has worked really hard to move to a city. Uncle puts up as much money as he can to get Ji Xianlin to go to a good school. Ji Xianlin excels at this school, ends up getting into good Chinese universities, studies Sanskrit, philology, and he ends up in Germany during the early Nazi years, from the early 30s till World War II, studying Sanskrit and then himself teaching there as a professor of philology. So World War II ends. Of course, China has its own, significant suffering and difficulties during World War II with Japan's imperialism, which, started sooner than Nazi imperialism. And after World War II ends, he goes back to China. And one of the things he thought when he was in Germany, as he saw the rise of Hitler and the Nazi scourge come along, he thought to himself, this would never happen in China. This is crazy. This is happening over here in the West. The West is kind of ignorant, especially Germany. I'm putting some words in his mouth, but this would never happen in China. He comes back to China. I believe he's teaching at Peking University, one of the best universities in China, in Beijing. If I remember correctly, it's been a few months since I read it, but he's teaching at the equivalent of that kind of university. And goes really well for a decade. He's a card-carrying communist. He thinks what the government's doing, yes, they have some missteps, but more or less they're doing what's right. And then, of course, as the subtitle of the book is, Memories of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. So Cultural Revolution begins in the 60s, where more or less Chinese Communist Party wants to modernize more rapidly. So they have to get rid of any people who think otherwise. They have to get rid of more traditional culture. They have to find all the secret capitalists hiding around everywhere, stopping progress. So they do that. And Ji Xianlin at the beginning thinks, these people probably are secret capitalists. They are probably trying to mess with progress and mess with Chinese success. So let's, fine. Let's find them out and make them learn what they're doing, the struggle sessions and all this kind of thing. He more or less goes along with it. Well, until a few years in, he is found out as a secret capitalist because he loves beauty and poetry, and he teaches, and he has books at home, and he has a couple, antiques that he saved up for. So some of his former students and their friends come to his house, ransack his house, destroy things, find where he had hid his books, take him, and they force him to build his own prison on the campus, the university campus, and that is called the Cowshed. So that's what the Cowshed is. And he's in prison for years. He eventually gets to leave, but he's treated shamefully, and he's embarrassed and ashamed of himself. Some of his colleagues killed themselves before they could be put in the Cowshed, because there's a saying, a Confucian scholar, let me make sure I don't get it backwards. A Confucian scholar can never be humiliated. They can only die. No, I think I said it backwards because it comes back later in the book, and I won't spoil that because I think it would be a spoiler if I talk more about that. But some of his friends, colleagues had killed themselves when they realized what was going to happen to them because they weren't going to be put through that. And Ji Xianlin always viewed himself as a coward, that he never actually committed suicide and that he was put in prison. He viewed it as kind of a weakness. And then the book ends with a connection to Tiananmen Square and the student protests in 1989. So again, highly recommended book. Ji Xianlin is clearly a really smart and wise person. He quotes a lot of Chinese poetry, and of course he's a Sanskrit scholar as well, philologist, Indo-European linguistics. So that was also a really fascinating connection too. But I recommended this book to one of my students, and he read it, and he thought it was also really eye-opening as well. So just an amazing book, highly recommended as well. And then The Maniac, Labatut's new novel, After When We Cease to Understand the World. This is one I had been really, really excited for when I saw that it was going to be released. I got this on, I think, the day it came out or the day after, maybe, depending on if it was a work day, I can't remember. But I pretty much blew through this book. I read it in a few days, and I really, really liked it. So if you're not familiar with this book, just came out a few months ago, and it's more or less about John von Neumann. And last year, a biography of John von Neumann came out, which I thought was okay. It's a 300-page kind of popular biography. It's, a guy like von Neumann should have a biography that's about 1,000 pages, but no one's been able to put it together yet. So it was a decent biography. I didn't keep it. I brought it to the school in case any of my students want to read it. But this book, I was really excited because Labatut's last novel was basically about scientists, mathematicians mostly, who reach the horizon of what they can understand. Really high level physicists and mathematicians and so on. And then, of course, implicitly, you think of writers or artists who do the same thing. And I think he's still kind of continuing that track here with John von Neumann, because it begins with von Neumann, and I saw this really funny interchange online between a couple physicists, and it was talking about one of the physicists was saying, oh, the stuff that he's saying about von Neumann is very troubling, one of these physicists. And then another one, I think, who teaches at Cambridge or something, says, oh, I wouldn't worry too much about it. It's just fiction. Remember, it's just fiction. And I just think, it's almost like two toddlers talking about art, that kind of way of thinking. Oh, it's just fiction. And then it's like, oh yeah, I forgot. I don't actually have to worry about it. It's just fiction. But of course, in the end, it doesn't matter whether or not it is, a true historical event in the sense of, whether or not von Neumann actually did some of these things, like advocate for first strike policy against the USSR, or, so on and so on, anything that these scientists might have been worried about. Because they might as well have happened. Because in reality, they did happen. Maybe it wasn't von Neumann who did it, which I think it is proven that he did actually advocate for a first strike policy when in the early post-World War II years. But yeah, because that there are currently, in the year 2023, almost 2024, enough nukes to end all complex life on Earth, which is, the fact that we can think of ourselves as an intelligent species is just baffling, I think. But yeah, and then after the von Neumann parts, which are really fascinating, begins with Paul Ehrenfest, who I really hadn't known about. I had heard his name before, but I couldn't have told you anything about him. And then gets into von Neumann and ends with Lee Sedol against AlphaGo, which there's a fascinating documentary, I think maybe still on YouTube, about it. Google's DeepMind beating Lee Sedol in Go, and then the moment of the God move, which is just fascinating. My issue with Labatut, even though I really like his books and I'm excited for his next book, whatever he decides to write about, I don't think he ends books very well. I've been disappointed with the endings of both of his works I've read. And um, I tend to like unsatisfying endings, like classically unsatisfying endings, but that leave the reader, with something to think about. McCarthy is just a, total genius at these kind of endings, and I love those. Gaddis as well. Tons of writers, Joyce, whoever else you want to name. But Labatut, I think maybe that's just something he's working on in his craft. I don't think he can end a book, but highly recommended nonetheless. I really enjoyed it. It's very rare to find books that talk about, works of literature that talk about science and um, so-called STEM fields. Next is a pair of books. So I believe I mentioned Xi Chuan in my book on traditional Chinese literature. Of course, he's not traditional; he's still alive, but he's definitely engaged in the tradition of Chinese poetry. And to the left here, I have a book that's pretty hard to come by, but it is a translated selection of one of his best friends, Hai-Tzu, called Ripened Wheat, translated from the Chinese by Ye Chun. So this pair of books, I've been in English language circles, I've had a really hard time finding contemporary poetry I like. That being said, I do plan on releasing a video about some contemporary poets that I do enjoy, but I would say Xi Chuan is my favorite living poet today after reading this book, even keeping in mind the fact that I can't read Chinese. So, what do I like so much about the book? Well, partially it was perfect for me for when I found it, because along with Ji Xianlin, the Cowshed, which is kind of like a mixture of East and West, which is really the reading journey I'm going on. I'm not really talking too much about Chinese stuff here, although I mentioned a couple. I've really just totally dove into Chinese literature, history, civilization, everything, language. And Xi Chuan did the opposite. He was born in the mid 60s. So when he's turning 18, going to university, and he went to Peking University, the Cultural Revolution is just ending in the late 70s. So things are just starting to open up. Deng Xiaoping is he's opening up, thawing, culturally, thawing, trying to culturally, opening up economically, and all this kind of thing. And Xi Chuan has an interview in the back of this book that, was actually watched by millions of people, interestingly enough. You couldn't imagine that in, a solid, skilled poet in America having that happen. But, yeah, he was asked in this interview, when you went to Peking University, how did you feel? It's a really good university. And he said, oh, well, I thought it was a really beautiful campus, but the thing I was really excited for was the library. And he went to the library, and what was the first book he read? The Bible, the Christian Bible, because it was banned, and he wanted to find out what was so wrong with this book that it was banned. And I feel like for me, and in American culture, more or less, they might as well have banned Chinese literature, because so few people read it, even relatively well-read people, compared to the value of Chinese civilization. I would say, I think I said it in my other video, but I still feel that way. If you don't read Chinese stuff, it's like not knowing about Europe and then finding out about Europe, like European culture and history and literature. You would just be horrified, I think, of the fact that you didn't know about it yet. And I'm going through that now still with Chinese stuff. But so Xi Chuan, I already mentioned him. Haizi, one of my students told me how to say that correctly. He was contemporary. Xi Chuan is still alive. Haizi is not. Haizi, he killed himself around the same exact time as the Tiananmen Square student protests. I believe he died right before it, so it wasn't directly connected, but he eventually became kind of a symbol of that time. And he's a very popular poet, even still. One of my students had heard of him, had never read his poetry, but had heard his name. And yeah, I mean, luckily this one's bilingual, so I enjoy looking at the characters. I'm starting to pick up some characters, slowly but surely. But like, for example, a whole set of poems about Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau. So it's just fascinating to see the exact mirror of what I'm going through. And these poets from, really, they were getting going in the 80s, and then Xi Chuan is still writing poetry. So both highly recommended. Xi Chuan is very easy to get a hold of, New Directions, and then Haizi is a little harder, but highly recommended. Next, one of the other books I read, which I don't think I have here, no, I don't have it here, is, what is it, 19 Ways of Looking at Wang Wei. Eliot Weinberger's little, almost a chapbook on translation, specifically with Chinese poetry. And kind of started getting into Eliot Weinberger a little more because Eliot Weinberger was good friends with, or I guess still is, they're both alive, Gary Snyder. And Gary Snyder got into Chinese poetry and all that kind of thing back in the 70s. Also, Gary Snyder was, moved to the countryside and had his own land and gardening and stuff like that. So I almost kind of feel like I'm kind of, to a degree, going through that trajectory as well. But so Eliot Weinberger, one of the other books I've been dipping into this year is Dumbarton Oaks, Their 100 Latin Hymns, from Ambrose to Aquinas. Because I realized, all this Chinese poetry, a lot of this Chinese poetry that I'm reading was written from 300 AD to 1000 AD. Okay, what European poetry is written from then? I couldn't think of almost none. Of course, you have some Old English stuff. You have troubadours are just pushing the edge of that top limit around the year 1100. Beowulf was most likely written between 8 to 900 AD. So you do have a handful of things here and there, but for the time span, I was really kind of troubled with how little I knew. And then I was like, well, wait a minute. Catholic Latin hymns are like the most preserved poems from that time, songs, but you can call them poems. And so I got that anthology, and then I was also thinking like, well, just to be frank, I pretty much have a bad taste in my mouth about Christianity as a whole. So I think just subconsciously I've kind of just, half intentionally, half unintentionally ignored it. And I think it's unjustifiable because, it's been so influential. So at least the influence is important to understand. So I got this little essay collection, Angels and Saints, Eliot Weinberger. And one of the reasons I really liked it is because it has these, what are they called? Square poems? No, it was something else. It'll say it on the back. Let me see. What is it? Grid poems. That's it. Grid poems. And interestingly enough, there are grid poems, palindromes in Chinese culture. Reversible poems is what they call them. And actually, the first female member of Ulipo, Metai, she wrote a whole book about them, which I do have, but I'm not going to mention it in this video today. But this guy from the 9th century who is affiliated with the Carolingian Renaissance and Charlemagne. These poems are interspersed, but Weinberger, as you can imagine from the title, starts by talking about angels. Has a, relatively long essay, kind of short chapters about angels, then saints. The saints part I thought was really interesting, and then one single page on the afterlife. And yeah, it was just really interesting. This is the kind of essay collection where I think Eliot Weinberger read 1,000 books to write, 150 pages, but it really shows, and I really enjoyed it. I have to say, wasn't like a mind-blowing book, but it gave me a lot of other avenues to explore. A handful of saints that I want to look into, especially Saint Francis and Philip Neri, who was from time of the Renaissance, more or less, 1500s. And so, yeah, another highly recommended one. Then I'll just go really quick on these two here. So this one I found at the local used bookstore. Enough to Say It's Far, Selected Poems of Pak Chaesam. This is bilingual, and it's one of the Lockhart Library of Poetry and Translation from Princeton, which was edited by Richard Howard, who's fairly good contemporary poet, more or less. Yeah, I thought these poems are really, really nice. One thing I especially liked about them is they are continuing in the tradition, really, it's kind of like more of an Eastern tradition of poetry about daily life, not feeling like you have to write everything about politics or impress the ruling class with what you're writing. Like this one here, it just totally encapsulates what I'm trying to say perfectly. Nothing. And one of my students is actually Korean and pretty well versed in Korean poetry and literature, and she said this word nothing is maybe translated better as like the state of being carefree or carelessness. And the poem is here. Sometimes the wind blows over the plantain leaf, where the drops of water take their bright form and fall. Beyond this moment of perfect calm, life wants nothing. And yeah, just you can find this kind of tone and impression throughout all of Chinese literature, and I just love it. We really don't have quite enough of this in Western literature, I think. But yeah, another highly recommended. And then two that are probably, if you've been following the channel for a while, somewhat shocking, but I've been just trying to learn as much as I can about China. I've just kind of let my curiosity just took off the chains and just let it roll. And so that led me to thinking, well, what graphic novels or what comic books or what kind of visual culture is going on in China right now? And Alienated Majesty, the book buyer, his name's Steven. He's awesome. Swing by sometime and say hi to Steven. He's really knowledgeable about graphic novels. And so this one I picked up first, Night Bus by Zuo Ma, and this is put out by Drawn and Quarterly. And I'll just skim through some of the artwork because I was really, I'm really picky, to put it mildly, with graphic novels and things. I think this is the only one in my possession, actually. I have one at the school that is a Japanese graphic novel artist. It's kind of an autobiography. It's pretty interesting. Floating Life, I think is what it's called. Yeah, but this one was interesting. It definitely gives Studio Ghibli vibes. It's called Magical Realism on the back, which I'm just so sick of hearing the word magical realism, magical realist. But it's really nice. It's dedicated to his grandmother, and one of the things that I really connected with this graphic novel is the awareness of the countryside dying. The countryside is connected with the memories that he has and the time he spent with his grandmother who lived in the countryside, and her hometown is being bulldozed to create a factory, and everyone's really happy, and everyone is putting on useless additions to their house so that they can get more money from the government, even though the government never actually gives them more money for that useless labor. And the factory's made, everything's bulldozed, the river runs black with pollution, and the majority of people just cheer all the way to the mall, shopping mall. And I've been thinking about that kind of logic a lot with the United States. And it really, in connection with this next one too, this one is Matchmaker's Market, which is a contemporary comic put out translated and published by Paradise Systems in English. And I was really struck too with the artwork on this one because it's all blue. It's all written in blue tones, which is interesting. But this is all about matchmaking markets, common sight in public parks. At these open-air gatherings, parents swap information about their children in hopes of arranging a suitable marriage. So it's more or less something like Tinder, but the parents do it. So you're commodifying your child, telling people how tall they are, where they went to school, their job, if they have a car, what ID they have, because it's difficult sometimes to get IDs to move to this city or that city. And yeah, you're commodifying your children. You're putting your children on a market for sale and trade. And I think it really emphasizes the lack of separation between the current cultural and economic logic of the United States and China. And of course, China is, within reason, going to be, it either currently now has a larger economy or will very shortly have a larger economy than the United States. Of course, per capita, it's significantly different because of the huge population difference. But how did China get there? It did the exact same thing as the United States. Learned from the United States' mistakes. But the way I look at it, China's kind of replaying the 20th century, the United States 20th century in 30 years, starting in the late 80s with the thaw of Deng Xiaoping. So, of course, I'm not an expert, so I'm sure somebody would criticize that to a degree, but I think it's more or less correct. And these graphic novels that are being put out contemporarily seem to agree with me. Well, that was my year in reading. I read almost double what I read last year, and that was my goal. I wanted to read more, spend less time doing meaningless stuff like, screen time and doing stuff like that, spend less time watching movies, that kind of thing, and spend more time reading. Movies aren't meaningless, but I find more value in reading generally. So yeah, I'm looking forward to what I read next year. I'm also going to be recording hopefully a short video on what I'm looking forward to reading, what I'm currently reading, and So feel free to leave in the comments what you read, any standout books that you'd recommend that you think I might like, or just in general, anyone else who watches the video, if you think they might like them, or any recommendations on jumping off points from these. So hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching, and death is a gang boss.